whether he is free with quotation marks or not, he's not actually free. He can't do what I can do. He still has to hide, and that's got to be a burden on him.
It's been nearly 50 years since convicted killer and child rapist Lester Eubanks escaped custody. Authorities have been hunting the elusive criminal ever since.
He's one of the most wanted men in the country, is that right?
Right, he is.
Picture this. The year is 1973. It's a chilly December day in Columbus, Ohio. A group of convicted violent criminals let out of prison for a day. No, they didn't break out on their own. Believe it or not, back then, inmates were actually allowed to go on Christmas shopping trips with other inmates as a reward for good behavior. One of those men was Lester Eubanks. He was serving a life sentence for brutally murdering 14-year-old Mary Ellen Diener.
And after he shot her in the head, he wasn't finished. He went back and beat her over the head with a brick. You know, and the wisdom back then in Ohio, they took him and furloughed him for a day to a shopping mall, and he escaped that day, and he's never been seen again.
A crowded mall packed with families busy with their own holiday shopping. Excited kids eager to sit on Santa's lap and read him their Christmas list. Young couples high on holiday spirit. It all provided Lester Eubanks with the perfect escape opportunity. Eubanks was supposed to meet back up with the rest of the prisoners after he finished shopping, but he never showed up. In fact, Eubanks vanished, and he's been on the run, evading authorities ever since that fateful day 49 years ago.
Very violent, dangerous individual. Again, you know, he raped and murdered a 14-year-old girl.
I'm Kelly Kennedy, and you're listening to Dark Side of the Land. In 1966, Lester Eubanks was convicted of murdering 14-year-old Mary Ellen Diener in Mansfield, Ohio. In 2016, the Northern Ohio Violent Fugitive Task Force Cold Case Unit picked up the case. Pete Elliott with the U.S. Marshals Office says they are not giving up.
A little girl that one day wanted to become a nun.
It's no wonder that today they no longer allow convicted killers to see Santa at the mall because Eubanks took off that day. He left the Great Southern Shopping Center in Columbus, and he's been on the run ever since. Myrtle Carter was 26 years old when her sister's killer escaped. She's now 75 years old, and all these years later, the day still haunts her.
In shock, because we thought it was over. It's all in shock. That's the only word I can think of to say. In shock and angry.
Today, Spring Mill Street in Mansfield is pretty quiet. There's a few modest houses, a church. But back in 1965, there was a laundromat. Half-hour laundromat. And on November 13th, that's where 14-year-old Mary Ellen Diener and her younger sister, 12-year-old Brenda Sue, were, trying to help their parents out with the chores after the family's dryer broke. Carter says her mom wasn't worried about the girls being there at night because their grandmother lived just down the street. Carter tells me she'll never forget that night or the horror and pain that came along with it. That was the night Lester Eubanks brutally murdered her baby sister.
It's been over 50, almost 60 years. She was just a typical 14-year-old, giggling and loved to be with her friends and family.
Carter tells me in the middle of doing laundry, the sisters realized they were running short on change. So the older sister ran to another laundromat around the corner to get some more change. As she strolled down the quiet, dark street, she bumped into an older man. He was tall, nearly 6 foot. She didn't know it then, but she was staring into the eyes of the man who would take her life, Lester Eubanks. Eubanks grabbed Mary Ellen and dragged her behind a home on North Mulberry Street. Carter says Eubanks tried raping her sister, but when she started screaming, he shot her twice. When the 14-year-old didn't die, Eubanks finished her off by beating her in the head with a brick, the change spilling out all around her. Officers found the 14-year-old girl bloody and beaten, lying next to a pile of nickels and dimes. She was dead. Mary Ellen's grandmother heard the sirens and saw the police lights down the block. She told police her granddaughter was missing, and to her horror, she discovered that's why police were there. It was her sweet granddaughter. Her skirt had been pulled up, and it looked like someone tried to tear off her clothes.
The authorities figured Eubanks must have encountered her. They figured he saw her going and just waited, because he lived right there in the middle, basically between the two laundromats. And he just waited for her to come back and attacked her there.
Lester Eubanks was a Mansfield native. He was described as a good-looking guy, and he had a sort of charm about him. A lot of people liked him. But at 22 years old, he was already a convicted sexual predator. In 1959, when Eubanks was just 16, he sexually assaulted a 12-year-old girl. She was able to escape, thankfully. He was put on probation for that crime. And at the time of the murder, Eubanks was out on bond for the attempted rape of a waitress that worked at a restaurant right across the street from the second laundromat. That's where Mary Ellen was headed to. The 18-year-old waitress was working alone when Eubanks put her in a chokehold, dragged her into the bathroom, and threatened to kill her. He choked her until she passed out. Eubanks was released from jail for that crime just 2 weeks before Mary Ellen's murder.
He was out of jail on bond for raping a girl in a restaurant down the street further. I guess he liked to stay in that little area where he lived close and commit his crimes.
At the time of the murder, Eubanks lived in between the two laundromats. Police searched his apartment and found a bag with shell casings and bullets. They also found his revolver. The bullets from the teen's body matched the ones found in Eubanks' home. They also found his footprints at the crime scene. Carter said she had heard of him. She said he always seemed strange to her, and he was always walking down the street alone. Officers tracked Eubanks down. They stopped him on his walk home from church and took him into the station for questioning. At first, he lied, saying someone stole his gun, claiming he had nothing to do with the little girl's murder. But eventually, he did confess to the crime. He said that night he was at the Hollywood nightclub, hanging out dancing with a prostitute. While he was dancing, his gun fell out of his pants. A few people witnessed it. He says the prostitute left to see another client, but he told her he'd wait for her. He was still outside waiting when he saw Mary Ellen walking by. He said he tried to talk to her, but the little girl looked scared and wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. That's when he attacked her. He said he tried to rape her, but she was screaming so loud he had to cover her mouth. Eventually, he shot her twice and took off. He told police he went home to get cleaned up and calm himself down. A little bit later, he went back to head downtown to go dancing again. That's when he heard Mary Ellen screaming in agony. She was trying to get someone to help her. So he picked up a nearby brick and beat her to death. Then he picked up the prostitute and went back to dancing. Eubanks tried to plead insanity, but it didn't work. He was found guilty on May 25th, 1966, and Eubanks was sentenced to death. Some say he escaped justice here too when his sentence was reduced to life in prison without parole. That's because the death penalty was abolished. Up until he went on the run, Eubanks was seen as a model inmate. He spent 7 years on his very best behavior. In 1972, while on death row, the Columbus Dispatch featured the criminal in an article, calling him the best of the death row painters.
More than likely, I think Lester Eubanks is doing what he was good at, and that is painting. So if there's paintings out there, you know, he's going to be about 79, 80 years old. And on paper, with his fake identity, he may be a little less older or a little more older, but he hasn't quit his habits. And my guess is, wherever he is in the area he is in, he is a good artist, and he's probably still doing paintings as he did back in the 70s when he was in prison, in the 60s, and he's probably still doing that in the area that he's in now.
His model prisoner status earned him the reward of taking part in the Ohio prison system's rehabilitation activities at the time. Now, this sounds absolutely insane, but some prisoners got to go to football games. Others went on field trips to the Ohio State Fair.
That was 1973, so that was different times, different place, you know, different era.
Eubanks scored a Christmas shopping trip at the Great Southern Shopping Center in Columbus.
The fact that Eubanks, a convicted rapist and child murderer, was allowed to leave prison and go on a Christmas shopping spree at the mall, it sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It was crazy. Again, a very violent individual that was not only convicted, he confessed to it. And he was able to beat death row and then gain the trust of the prison and then go to a shopping mall and flee, you know, again, after murdering a 14-year-old girl. You know, and again, never to be seen again.
Carter is still furious that her sister's killer was ever allowed out of prison in the first place.
The Mansfield, the local authorities did what they were supposed to do. It was the Columbus authorities that dropped the ball and allowed him to leave.
Eubanks is 79 years old today.
Back in 2020, you told us you believed that Eubanks was using an alias, Victor Young, but you said you don't think he's still using that one?
I'm not sure. We don't believe he is. He is using a different name. I believe he's going to be in a different place. I believe there are people out there with information that could come forward as to his whereabouts, and I'm hoping that is the case.
What do you think Eubanks is doing now?
My guess is he's living wherever he is living very comfortably, trying to keep a low profile under a fake name, which he's been utilizing for a number of years. He's probably made friends in the area that he's in with individuals that don't know his true identity, and he's been able to do that, I believe, for a number of years.
Marshals have been on Eubanks' tail for years, and Elliot tells me they've come close to catching him before.
This murder happened in Mansfield. I understand he escaped from a mall in Columbus. Do you know any other states or areas that this man, Eubanks, has ties to?
Well, we did track him originally in the 1990s to Los Angeles, California. We were able to put him there. We were about a couple steps behind him, and then he was able to flee that specific area he was in. You know, we've taken over this case in the U.S. Marshals Service. We've now made him a top 15 in the whole nation. We've put out a $50,000 reward for anybody with any information, and I am 100% confident that we are going to capture him.
U.S. Marshals were able to get their hands on some photos that they thought showed Eubanks working and socializing with people in Los Angeles. But as it turned out, it wasn't actually him in those photos. Authorities do believe that Eubanks was living in California. They believe the fugitive might have lived in Gardena, South Los Angeles, Long Beach, and North Hollywood at different times over the years. It's also believed that back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Eubanks worked as a janitor at St. Francis Hospital in Linwood. Leads over the years have also placed the longtime fugitive in Michigan. Authorities believe Eubanks might even be married with children, who have no idea he's a wanted fugitive, or that he's a man who has committed violent rapes and murders. But Marshals did get a break in the case in 2019 when a man believed to be Eubanks' biological son agreed to hand over his DNA. The man believes Eubanks had raped his late mother. Elliot tells me they tried to compare that man's DNA with DNA taken from other unsolved crimes across the country. just to see if they'd get any hits that could point them in the right direction. But unfortunately, it was just another dead end.
Although we didn't get any hits back that was anything substantial.
Elliott says the U.S. Marshal's office is still pursuing Eubanks, and they're getting closer. They're offering a $50,000 reward for the fugitive's arrest.
Do you ever worry, though, that he could have, still being out there, he could have hurt other girls?
Yeah, I was concerned about that, but you still have to let that go, too.
Elliott says he's sure that Eubanks has not stopped committing vicious and violent crimes.
Guys like this, violent criminals, do you think he's still out there committing crimes?
Do I believe Lester Eubanks has attacked young females? I do. I believe he's never stopped committing his crimes. It's just not something that you can turn off or he can turn off, and that's why it's so important that we take him off the streets as soon as we can.
Authorities tell me Eubanks is about 5'11" with brown eyes and black hair. At the time of his disappearance, he weighed about 175 pounds. Some unique features include a mole under his left eye and a large scar and burn on his upper right arm. Now remember, Eubanks is dangerous. He's a violent criminal with a serious history. If you see him, do not approach him. Just call 911 or contact the Northern Ohio Fugitive Task Force at 1-866-4-WANTED.
We're looking for the day, we're looking forward to that day where we can bring him back and put him in our jail cell right here where he belongs forever.
Elliott says he's confident they'll close this case and they'll bring justice to Diener's family members, like her older sister, Myrtle Carter.
People have asked why we take up these cold cases and there's always more victims than the one that's shot and stabbed. There's a whole family of victims. There's mothers and fathers and there's brothers and sisters that have to continue to live with this every single day of their lives.
I'm Kelly Kennedy, and this is Dark Side of the Land.
Subscribe now for future episodes and find more Dark Side of the Land and photo galleries related to these cases at cleveland19.com.